think there's a question in the back. I'll do you next, yeah.
Okay, Irving, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. First, you have said that large-scale assessments are useful to compare groups, not individuals. So, what do you think? Could the PISA results be used to compare schools, one school, one other school? And the second question is, you have said the final slide that PISA will be a more complex design. It's the future. Mm-hmm. But I have remembered a phrase from Sir David Cox in the book the Experimental Design for Scientific and Research. The more complex the design is, the less reliability its results has.
The less what?
The more complex the design is, the less reliability its results has. So, what about?
Okay. Well, those are two really different questions. So the first question about comparing schools. I think what you have to look at is whether the data support the inferences you want to make, right? So, you know, you can certainly calculate the difference between schools or the similarity between schools, and for some purposes, those comparisons seem reasonable. If you just want to know kind of what the variability is in the population across schools, you could certainly do that. You could look at the mean, you could look at the average, you could look at the variability, etc. The question is, does that really do those comparable questions make sense? Is that the kind of inference you want to make? And one of the questions is, well, how else do schools differ other than by ability? Right? I mean, the schools can be organized so that they represent different levels of ability. Right? They could have different principal characteristics. They could have different teacher characteristics. They can have parental differences. That is, the parents of the students who go. So there are lots of variability that would impact the distribution of skills within a school. So it seems to me it depends on what question you're trying to answer. And again, it comes to whether or not the questions that you want to answer are supported by the structure of the data that you collect. I mean, one of the things I've noticed in PISA is there's this big comparison of within school and between school differences. Well, in the U.S., most of the variability is within schools. So when you get to large high schools, the way the U.S. secondary education system was built, it was built around these large high schools. So you have more elementary schools, and then those elementary schools feed into a smaller number of middle schools, and they feed into a much smaller number of high schools. So when I went to high school many years ago, I had 1,000 kids in my graduating class from high school. Yeah? And it was one of the best high schools in the city that I grew up. And there was another, it was an all-boys high school, and there was another one that had similar characteristics. But it drew from local neighborhoods, and if you wanted to go there and it was not in your neighborhood, you had to have a certain average, grades and courses to get in. So if you just looked at within and between school variance, you'd see huge within school variance. Where my kids went to high school, it was a very similar. They had 800 and some kids in their graduating class. And it went from what we have in the U.S. AP classes, this advanced placement, to honors classes, to college level classes, to sort of the lower track classes, all within a single school. So you have the full range of ability within that high school as you would have. But there are other high schools that are much more selective, and the range of ability would be much narrower. And so I think you can't just decide that statistically you can compare the average, or you can calculate the average, and then the comparison makes sense. So I think you really have to start with is whether the question makes sense and whether the data support the question, or you need additional data. In terms of the designs, I don't think it's always the case that a more complex design yields more or less reliable data. I think, as I understood designs when I went through graduate school, is that designs are set up to really reduce error and to be able to tease out and disentangle different kinds of questions. So, there were some designs in analysis of variance that were really straightforward. You can compare two groups. If you wanted to do other things and look at covariance or look at trend or looking at change over time, that simple design wouldn't answer. So I think if the designs are put together well, and they're from a conceptual point of view, they're designed to answer a specific set of questions, and they're designed to support the infrastructure that relate to those questions, and the sample sizes are large enough, and that they're carried out well. That is, operationally, they're implemented well. I think you get better data. I think you get a much richer picture of the kinds of information you're looking for. In a paper and pencil world, those designs, the original designs, were put together really small-scale assessments with a couple hundred kids. PIAC had 150,000, a sample of 150,000 adults. I don't know. I don't know what the sample size in PISA is. It must be about 300,000 students. These are much larger designs. Computers make the designs much more efficient. You could never do these kinds of designs in paper and pencil. I don't want to scare you, but in PISA for the field test, there's like going to be 90 different forms, 95 different forms in a country that's doing, because you have to do mode studies. But the countries won't have to do any of that. Right? Most of it is done inside the computer, and the consortium is going to do all the paper forms. We're going to assemble them, we're going to quality control them, we're going to put them in their print-ready copy. All countries have to do is print them. Right? The computer will handle the assignment of students to different forms. It will handle the workflow within the computer. So from a design point of view, the designs are more complex, but the computer makes them much more efficient. So I may be biased, but I believe that given where people want to go with the kinds of questions that they want to answer, that you need more complex designs, and I think the psychometrics and the technology and the methodologies will keep up to allow you to do that in a reliable and valid way. But if there are people who feel otherwise, I think that's what makes for good science. You have people who take opposing points of view. They do studies to show where there may be errors. Then other people come along and improve the methodology to eliminate or reduce those errors, and then you move on. So it's more of an evolutionary kind of thing. So I think we're now in this sort of we've changed the trajectory again, and we're going to be in this kind of evolutionary mode again, and there will be, there'll be some what I would call healthy tension between people who have different points of view about what can and can't get done. So, but I think that's good, because it will lead to improvements over time and better use of the data. So for me, it's a good thing.